This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.
And welcome to the City of God podcast, where we are weekly discussing today's biggest cultural issues all through the lens of God's infallible word. My name is Rob Pacienza, and today we are joined by Tim Barton, who is the president of Wall Builders, an incredible ministry that is helping to preserve the true story of our great nation. So Tim, thank you so much for joining me today.
Rob, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Well, let's dive into the new book. So you wrote this book with your dad, David Barton.
Yes.
Just in case our audience hasn't put that together so far. So your dad's David Barton. So you wrote the book, The American Story, Building the Republic. And just like the name Wall Builders and the mission of Wall Builders, why is this book and really your ministry as a whole so important in the 21st century?
That's a loaded question that we can unfold for a little bit, but I would say our goal is to teach American history and help restore a biblical foundation. We think those two things go hand in hand together, because the more you understand American history, the more you understand it was the biblical foundation that helped America become the nation she became. And as a Christian, the more we understand a biblical perspective, biblical worldview, the more we should want to impact our nation as well. So we think those two things line up and go hand in hand as we're looking at the nation, where I think we have seen such a crisis is the attack on truth. And obviously truth, big picture, but truth is becoming a subjective idea. It's up to the individual to decide. And as a Christian, that's something that is very concerning, because if truth is subjective, how is the gospel going to be effective when someone can say, well, that's your truth, right? But for me, here's what I believe. That's not how truth actually works. But we see truth under attack in science. We see truth under attack in history. And so for us, our motivation even to tell the honest story of America is a deeper motivation, that we want to preserve truth because we want people to know who God and who Jesus are, and also understand that when you do things God's ways, you position yourself to enjoy God's blessings, right? It's got the sowing and reaping thing as well. Like, you sow the right kind of seed, you're going to reap this kind of fruit. And so we want to try to help people understand those connections. But this is where truth does exist. The truth of seasons, the truth of sowing and reaping, the truth of God's word. And so we think that truth is probably the biggest attack, or the biggest thing being attacked in culture right now, and where we're focusing so much of our energy defending what actually happened in history with truth. And that's part of what led us to write another book.
Yeah. So for somebody listening or watching this podcast, they hear about the American story, Building the Republic, by you, Tim Barton, and your father, David Barton. And they go, well, I've read plenty of books about American history. I've read plenty of books about the constitutional republic. Why is this book unique? What are they going to learn and read in this book that makes it unique and set apart from just kind of all the other books about American history?
Yes, it's such a good question. So this is part 2 in our series. The first one was the American story, Building the Republic. We start with Christopher Columbus. We go roughly through past the Revolution, through the Constitutional Convention, and we get a Constitution, we become a nation. That's kind of where that book goes. This one picks up from there with the early presidents. And what is unique about this one, in all of our books, we will footnote things. And this book is no exception. We have more than 1,000 footnotes in the back, because we understand we live in a culture where it's very hard to know who to trust and to know what to trust. And instead of doing what modern academics do, and they would say, well, I have a PhD, right? You should trust me because I'm really smart. We go the opposite, and we say, please don't trust us. Here's the original document. Go look it up for yourself and see what it says, because we know when people pursue truth, that the truth will testify, right, to an even greater extent than what we are condensing to tell the story. So for George Washington as an easy example, there are thousands of books that have been written about George Washington. There's nothing new that we could tell you about George Washington other than we come from a very different perspective in the way we present history, and different than probably what the majority of historians do. We come from a biblical perspective that we know there is a God, and therefore we don't try to disconnect the God aspect from the story of history, where it actually would probably be more dishonest. If we were to read the Old Testament and you're going to try to tell the Old Testament story of Moses with no God, how is that even possible? Well, it's not. Right, because when God moves in such obvious ways, it's more dishonest to leave God out than it is where some people would say, but you're trying to push God in. No. We don't even say we think God did this. We will just quote the people who were there who said, we think God did this, because there's no other way this makes sense. And what we would also point out is that when people think they've read and they know the stories, the first 7 presidents, you have Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, and Jackson. And of those 7, probably the first 4 presidents, most people know those names. Most people aren't as familiar with the next 3, with James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. But I would go further and say that even though we know their names, we have a faulty assumption that because we're familiar with their names that we know their stories.
Yeah.
Most people have no idea their stories. And we go through and try to tell a fun biographical story along the way. And I would say, again, this is where in these books, we try to follow the biblical model where modern academics, they focus on names, dates, and places. And we try to tell the story.
Yeah.
If you look in the Bible and we ask a modern academic question from a Bible story and say, in what year did David kill Goliath? I have no idea in what year. Why? Because the Bible doesn't tell us what year he did. Why? Because that's not the point of the story.
Yep.
Right? And what we have tried to do, now we include names and dates and places, but we try to not divorce the whole point of the story from what's there. And so there's going to be fun tidbits. If somebody were to ask, what is a crazy thing you learned about George Washington that maybe you didn't know? Well, most people know that he had a false set of teeth. He had dentures, and there's a lot of things surrounding that, some misnomers with that. But when he was president, he only had one real tooth. And then that tooth fell out while he was president. So our first president had no teeth.
Wow.
Right? Like there's some bizarre things along
absolutely.
the way. Now, also it's worth noting, our first president also went through multiple battles, and he was in some battles where he was the only officer not shot down and not killed.
It's amazing.
And so you start putting some of these together and you learn the story. You go, this guy was amazing. He really was.
Yeah.
But it's because you know what the story is.
Why they wanted to crown him as king, and thankfully
That's exactly
rejected
right.
that, but yeah.
Right?
Yep,
Where
larger than life figure.
Right. His soldiers are like, we don't trust Congress, but we trust you, because everyone that knew him knew that he was an honorable person. They knew he was a godly person. In fact, we don't get into it a lot in this version or this edition, but we have other things where you write that everybody that ever talked about Washington and identified his faith, everybody that knew him said he was a Christian.
Wow.
And it's interesting that in modern era, right, people are like, well, we think he's a deist or he didn't really believe in God. Then how come everybody that knew him said he was a Christian? Or you can go to, for example, his adopted daughter, Nellie Custis. When George married Martha already had a couple kids, and George and Martha never had kids themselves. Well, Martha's kids ended up having kids. One of her child died. So then there's one, and they had 4 kids, and then the husband died. And so then a single mom with 4 kids, and she's overwhelmed. So George and Martha said, we're going to adopt your 2 youngest, make it easier for you. And so those 2 youngest, in essence, were George and Martha's kid. Well, the daughter that was there was Nellie Park Custis, but her name was Nellie. And when George Washington died, a historian wrote her and said, can you give me any stories about his faith? I'm just very curious. I want to write about him, but I want to include stories of his faith. And her letter back is fascinating. She concludes her letter with, sooner should we question his patriotism than question his Christianity. So literally everybody that knew him was like, this dude's a devout Christian.
Yeah.
And yet today we know so little. So what we try to do is go back and reintroduce people to names that they know, but stories that they don't.
Yep.
And then we footnote it all. And then we also make some connections, because we point out these were the first 7 presidents, and they set examples for us, and we can learn from their examples on really good things we need in a president, and maybe some things we don't want in a president, right? Some decisions we should stay away from. And in any time we have elections, it's always probably good to look back and go, what kind of leaders should we have?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love what you just said about Washington, because the predominant narrative is he was a-religious at worst and maybe a deist at best. But it's well known that his favorite doctrine was divine providence.
Right.
The hand of the providential God. That is a providential God means that he is intervening in the affairs of humankind.
When George Washington wrote about the American Revolution, more than 250 times he mentions divine providence.
Absolutely.
And right.
That's not a deist God.
No. And where people say, well, the word providence, though, that's an impersonal word for God. And therefore, he must be a deist. And I would point out, we'll go back to the Bible back in that era, right? The Geneva Bible, what the Pilgrims, the Puritans came to America. In the Geneva Bible, it mentions the word or uses the word providence 144 times. George Whitefield, most famous evangelist, First Great Awakening. Every founding father had heard and listened to George Whitefield. We actually have printed sermons from George Whitefield because at Wall Builders, we have a huge collection of original documents. We have several George Whitefield sermons. George Whitefield has a sermon where his sermon title is Zacchaeus Seeing Providence for Himself.
Wow.
Now, who does Zacchaeus see? He saw Jesus.
Yep.
And in the sermon, he says Zacchaeus climbed the tree so he could see providence for himself.
Yep.
Multiple times in the sermon, he described Jesus as providence because the idea of providence was God's hand moving in people's life. Well, that's what Jesus was, right?
Yep.
He was the representation of God in human form.
He was active. He was intervening. He was present.
Right.
They saw his hand all throughout the Great American Experiment.
Right. And that was their perspective of this word.
So
they knew exactly what that was. So even when you go to someone like a Benjamin Franklin, who's considered the least religious founding father, at the Constitutional Convention, June 28, 1787, where they're having all kinds of issues, right? And he's like, I think we need to find some resolution. He gets up. The longest speech he gave was a motion that they go back to prayer. But one of the things he said is, at the most significant and crucial moments of the revolution, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection, because they were in Independence Hall, the same room that they did the Declaration. 11 years later, they're in the Constitution. He said, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. He said, and our prayers were heard and they were graciously answered, which also then is a super interesting thought. They were praying every single day during the revolution, according to Franklin. But then he acknowledges that God answered their prayers. And this is why, to me, when people say they're deists, I only think that you have not studied history and you don't know them very well, because a deist doesn't believe God gets involved and he doesn't answer prayers.
No, he's hands off.
Right? Now, I mean, we might could argue, I don't think Franklin was a Christian.
No.
But I could also say, I have a lot of friends in Israel who are Jews.
Yep.
And they believe in a God and they pray to God, and it's the same God that I pray to. They just don't believe in his son like I believe in his son, right?
Yep.
Well, right. So then what you could argue is Franklin actually, then there's several fun letters from him where he talked about his faith. And toward the end of his life, the president of Yale University was Ezra Stiles, and he was good friends with Franklin. They gave Franklin an honorary degree because Franklin never had a formal education that finished. He was an elementary school dropout. And they gave him an honorary degree as kind of like a master's degree as a scientist. He was a pretty bright guy. Mm-hmm. And he writes him a letter toward 3 months before he dies and says that the longer letter he goes into, we want to put up a picture, we want to honor you in Yale. But at the end of it, he says, I just want to ask you your position of Jesus, because I feel like I would be amiss as a friend and as a pastor if I didn't ask you, where do you stand on Jesus? Do you believe he truly was the Son of God? Was he divine? And he goes through several thoughts on Jesus. And he says, now, I mean, this is no aggressive intent, no offense. If this bothers you, please forget I asked this. I would not want this to intrude upon our friendship. We've been friends for so many years, and et cetera. Franklin writes him a letter back. And Franklin, in this letter, addresses the question. He says, it's interesting you asked me that question. He said, no one's ever asked me that really question before, which is also fascinating, because Franklin was friends with George Whitefield, and George Whitefield would pray often for Franklin. Mm-hmm. But apparently nobody asked Franklin his views on Jesus, which again is just super interesting.
Yeah.
It does seem to give an inclination toward the fact that in early America, there was such a heavy bent toward Calvinism that it was just a different thought, even of evangelism. It was a very different thought. But Franklin says,
that's a good point.
Franklin says that I've never investigated the subject, and this is something that someone should not flippantly give an answer to if they've not done the research. I haven't done the research. He said, now, at my old age, and this is great because it's so Franklin witty, he says, I'm sure at my old age, I will soon discover if he truly is divine or not. Yeah. He says, but at present, here's my belief. I believe there is one God who created the heavens and the earth. I believe that he rewards the righteous, he punishes the wicked. I do believe that there is an afterlife. And I believe that he gave us the Old and New Testament to be guides for us how to conduct ourselves morally and how to live a life that is the most pleasing to him. He said, I'm just not sure if Jesus truly was divine or not. Yep. Now, again, while that matters, Franklin, I would not argue was a Christian, because you can't argue that. Now, also, this letter came 3 months before he died. I think it's also super possible the Holy Spirit's like, investigate Jesus real quick.
Absolutely.
It's totally possible
Absolutely.
that we see Franklin in heaven. He could have made that decision in his life.
That could be amazing. That could be amazing. That's great insight.
Like intuitively, I'm just like, I don't know if I can pray for something that's already happened to happen, right? Like, God, please let Franklin.
But you want it to be true. You want it to be true.
I want to see it there. But the fact is that even Franklin wasn't a guy who was dismissive of faith.
Yep.
Franklin was a devout believer in God. He just wasn't sure about the other details.
Yeah.
And you can back up in Franklin's life because for many founding fathers, their lives were journeys and they were roller coasters. And when people talk about the founding fathers not being religious, Franklin is such a fun guy to use an example because Franklin's the only one that ever self-identified as a deist.
Yep.
But he did it in his autobiography. And if anybody has ever said, well, Franklin's a deist, I'm always like, where did he say that? And they don't usually know. And I say, as autobiography. And then I say, have you ever read it? And they're like, well, I'm not sure. I said, well, you should read it because it's like 3 paragraphs where he talks about being a deist. And the reason it matters is it starts off, Franklin says, when I was 15 years old, I was reading the debates between some pastors and some deists, and it struck me that the deists were making better arguments than the pastors were. He said, so I determined to myself I would be a deist. Next paragraph. He says, but upon further consideration, I realized that although they might have been correct in some of their arguments, the belief of deism itself was of no use to me and would be of no benefit to anyone else. So I quickly left that belief behind.
Yeah.
So Franklin, by his own acknowledgement, was like a deist for maybe a day and a half, maybe a week and a half, right? Like It wasn't a long time.
It's amazing.
And this is who we would argue was the least religious founding father.
No, that's so helpful. Now, last question for you, Tim. The other narrative is that the founders wanted a secular public square, regardless of their private religious convictions. What can we point to, in addition to the testimonies of the founding fathers that you just mentioned? What else can we point to? Founding documents, the way the government was structured, other indicators that we see in the establishment of this republic that point to this was not founded as a secular public square, but a public square that was influenced and informed by a biblical worldview. So good of a question. There's lots of answers that we go very deep. The very quick, easy one is look at their prayer proclamations. Because when the American Revolution starts, one of the first acts of the Continental Congress is they call for a colony-wide, of all 13 colonies, a nationwide day of prayer and fasting, asking for God to intervene on their behalf. That fall, they do a day of prayer and thanksgiving. The next spring, they do a day of prayer and fasting. They had 13 prayer proclamations from the Continental Congress just during the American Revolution. But to expound upon that, by 1815, there were more than 1,400 official government prayer proclamations from governors, from presidents, or from Congress. So when someone says the founding fathers weren't religious, my question is, then why did they pray all the time? And why did they call on their states or on the nation to pray all the time? All the time.
Because if the assessment we're trying to make is the founding fathers didn't want religion involved, this is what people argue, well, separation of church and state. Okay, George Washington is our first president. He was president of the Constitutional Convention, right? He's the guy that oversees the writing of it. James Madison, also known as the father of the Constitution, I think he's one of the 5 most important guys there. I don't know, I wouldn't give him all the credit, right? But he's very important. But he is the guy that largely comes up with the main ideas from the Bill of Rights. Well, after they do the Bill of Rights, there's 12 amendments initially that send them to the colonies to be ratified. Congress, James Madison is there. Congress petitions Washington and they say, hey, we think the most logical thing for us to do now that we have done our duty, we've come up with these amendments in the states, we should have a day of prayer and thanksgiving that as a nation, we should thank God. Washington agreed. Now, this is a big deal because you have literally the people that wrote the Constitution, that wrote the Bill of Rights, suggest that the very next thing we should do is have a day to pray and thank God for what he did. They did not believe in a secular square. They understood without God's help, they would never succeed in what they were doing, which is why they never tried to secularize it. Did they believe in a separation of church and state? They believed in separate institutions. They did not believe in secular institutions, which is a huge distinction.
Yep, absolutely. Tim, thank you so much for your time today. I encourage our audience to pick up a copy of The American Story, Building the Republic by Tim Barton and by David Barton. Thank you so much for your voice and for continuing to educate, particularly the next generation. I think of the number of children and that are out there that need to hear the true story of our great republic. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for writing this, thank you for the Ministry of Wall Builders.
Thank you so much.
And I want to thank you for joining us today on this podcast. If you are encouraged by this conversation with Tim Barton of Wall Builders. We pray that you would pass this along to family members, friends, or anyone who wants to explore today's biggest cultural issues all through the lens of God's infallible word. Thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on The City of God.
The City of God podcast is produced by Coral Ridge Ministries and made in partnership with the Institute for Faith and Culture. Visit us at cityofgodpodcast.com to access all of our previous episodes. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or anywhere you get podcasts. A full video version of this podcast is available on YouTube. This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.